October 7, 1944. Eindhoven, Netherlands, 14:30 hours. The Allied war machine was supposed to be winning. Paris had fallen to the Allies on August 25, 1944. The German army had retreated across France in chaos. In 6 weeks, Allied forces had advanced further than anyone had projected in 6 months. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower sat at his headquarters with every reason to believe the war would be over by Christmas. Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, commander of the British 21st Army Group, the most decorated general in the British Empire, looked at Eisenhower's plans and said something no subordinate officer had ever said to a supreme commander in the history of modern coalition warfare. He called them balls. Sheer balls. Not in private, not in a whispered aside to a trusted aide. He said it directly to Eisenhower's face, in a caravan conference that would permanently fracture the Allied High Command, stall the advance into Germany, and cost tens of thousands of lives in a campaign that should never have been fought the way it was. And the shocking part? Montgomery wasn't entirely wrong. This is the story of the greatest strategic argument in the Western Allied Command. A clash of ego, doctrine, national pride, and military logic that shaped the final year of World War II and left soldiers dying in Dutch canals and Ardennes snowdrifts while their generals fought each other in map rooms. To understand why this confrontation happened, you have to understand who these two men were and why they were almost constitutionally incapable of agreeing. Dwight David Eisenhower had never commanded troops in combat before June 6, 1944. That is not an insult. It is a precise and important fact. Eisenhower was a coalition manager, a political general in the best possible sense of that phrase. His genius was institutional. He could hold together an alliance of fractious nationalities, American, British, Canadian, Free French, Polish, and keep them pointed in the same direction. He had 39 divisions under his command by September 1944, over 2 million men, the largest land army the Western Allies had ever assembled. His strategy was called the broad front approach. Advance across the entire front simultaneously. Press the Germans everywhere. Don't give them room to recover. Use American industrial superiority. 40,000 tanks, 300,000 vehicles, 12,000 aircraft, to grind the Wehrmacht into dust. It was a strategy built on abundance. Bernard Law Montgomery had been fighting since 1940. He had commanded at Dunkirk. He had rebuilt the broken 8th Army in the North African desert. He had defeated Erwin Rommel at El Alamein in October 1942. Ending Germany's threat to Egypt and the Suez Canal. Montgomery believed in the narrow thrust. Concentrate all available resources. Strike one massive blow at one precise point. Break through. Don't stop. He believed Eisenhower's broad front strategy was strategically illiterate. He believed that advancing everywhere simultaneously meant advancing powerfully nowhere. And by September 1944, he had a specific target in mind: the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland, the source of 70% of German steel production and over 60% of its coal. Montgomery believed that if the Allies drove a single armored spear through the Netherlands, crossed the Rhine at Arnhem, and swung south into the Ruhr, the war would end in 1944. Eisenhower disagreed. What followed was not just a military disagreement. It was a collision between two philosophies of war, two national traditions, and two men whose personalities could not have been more precisely designed to irritate each other. Here is the fact that most documentary accounts underplay. By September 1944, the Allied advance had outrun its own supply lines by approximately 400 miles. The primary Allied port of supply was still Cherbourg, on the Normandy coast. The front lines were in Belgium and the Netherlands. Every gallon of fuel, every artillery shell, every meal ration had to travel that distance, mostly by truck, because the French rail network had been systematically destroyed by Allied bombing campaigns earlier in the year. The famous Red Ball Express, 6,000 trucks running 24 hours a day, was moving approximately 12,500 tons of supplies daily by late August. The Allied armies needed 20,000 tons per day to sustain full-scale offensive operations across the entire front. This was the logistical reality that Eisenhower's broad front strategy could not escape. There was simply not enough fuel to go around. Patton's Third Army, racing toward Germany in the south, received 32,000 gallons of fuel on September 2, 1944. It needed 400,000. His tanks literally stopped in the field. The solution to this crisis was sitting 60 miles behind the front lines. Antwerp. The Allies had captured the port city of Antwerp on September 4, 1944, one of the largest and most capable deep-water ports in Europe. But they had failed to clear the Scheldt estuary, the 60-mile waterway connecting Antwerp to the North Sea. German forces held both banks. No ship could enter. This was a strategic error of the First Order, and it had been made by Montgomery himself, the man who would spend the next 3 months criticizing Eisenhower's strategy. The port of Antwerp would not become operational until November 28, 1944. By then, 83 days had been lost. Soldiers on both sides had died in those 83 days. The war had not ended, and in those 83 days, 2 of the most consequential military decisions of the Western campaign were made. One behind a desk in a map room, and one in the air over the Netherlands. The confrontation happened in Montgomery's personal command caravan, parked outside Eindhoven. Eisenhower had flown in. He had a painful knee injury from a recent aircraft incident and walked with difficulty. Montgomery asked him to sit down. Then he told Eisenhower, to his face, that his broad front strategy was producing confusion and a grave risk of losing the initiative. He handed Eisenhower a written document, a memo he had prepared. It listed his objections with clinical precision. Eisenhower read it. Then Montgomery, according to witnesses, escalated. He said that the Allied advance was ragged and disjointed, and that Eisenhower's plan was not a sensible operation of war. Eisenhower placed his hand on Montgomery's knee. He said, quietly but directly, "Steady, Monty. You can't speak to me like that. I'm your boss." Montgomery backed down, slightly. He apologized for his tone, but he did not withdraw his argument. This exchange reveals the core philosophical divide. Montgomery's doctrine, shaped by his experience of catastrophic British losses in World War I and his own campaigns in North Africa, was built on the principle of never attacking without overwhelming superiority at the point of decision. He called it methodical battle. Set the conditions, destroy the enemy's ability to respond, then strike with everything. Eisenhower's doctrine was American in its bones: industrial scale, sustained pressure, flexibility over concentration, accept friction, overwhelm it with resources. Neither man was wrong in the abstract. They were wrong for each other. Montgomery's method required a level of logistical priority that an American supreme commander, answerable to American public opinion and American generals like Patton and Bradley, could never politically deliver. Eisenhower's method required a supply situation that, in September 1944, simply did not exist. The pivot point was Operation Market Garden, launched September 17, 1944. It was Montgomery's plan, his single, narrow thrust: executed with the largest airborne operation in history. 35,000 paratroopers dropped across 64 miles of Dutch countryside. 3 airborne divisions, American 82nd and 101st, British 1st Airborne. The objective: seize 8 bridges across the Netherlands river network, including the Rhine crossing at Arnhem. Hold them until 30th Corps, armored ground forces, drove up a single highway and linked up. If it worked, the Allies would be across the Rhine in 48 hours. Montgomery told Eisenhower it had a 90% chance of success. It failed, not because the concept was entirely wrong, because the execution contained errors that military historians have spent 80 years cataloging. The British 1st Airborne Division dropped 8 miles from Arnhem Bridge, the farthest landing zones from the objective of any division in the operation. Why? The RAF refused to make a second drop on the first day, citing aircraft safety concerns. An alternative drop zone, closer to the bridge, was rejected because planners feared German anti-aircraft guns near the polder fields. Polish intelligence officer Major Urquhart had obtained aerial photographs showing 2 SS Panzer divisions, the 9th and 10th, refitting near Arnhem. This intelligence was presented to 1st Airborne Army headquarters. It was set aside. The 9th and 10th SS Panzer divisions were at Arnhem. They were there on September 17th. They destroyed the British 1st Airborne. Of 10,000 British paratroopers who dropped at Arnhem, approximately 1,900 were evacuated across the Rhine 9 days later. Over 1,400 were killed. More than 6,000 were captured. 30th Corps reached Nijmegen. It did not reach Arnhem. The highway, soldiers called it Hell's Highway, was cut by German counterattacks 4 times during the operation. The bridge at Arnhem, held by a single British battalion under Lieutenant Colonel John Frost for 4 days against an entire SS Panzer division, was one of the most extraordinary defensive stands in the war. It was also irrelevant, because no relief came. Market Garden consumed 88 days of supply stockpiles. It produced no strategic breakthrough. It left the Allied front essentially where it had been. And it fatally weakened the resources available for clearing the Scheldt estuary, the operation that would have opened Antwerp and solved the supply crisis. Montgomery's argument against Eisenhower's broad front strategy was partially correct. His alternative produced a disaster that validated Eisenhower's caution. Both men had been right and wrong simultaneously. That is the central paradox of the Western Allied Command in 1944. The Hurtgen Forest, September 19th to December 16th, 1944. While Montgomery and Eisenhower argued strategy, American soldiers walked into the Hurtgen Forest. 19,000 German casualties, 33,000 American casualties, killed, wounded, captured, and non-battle losses from exposure. The Hurtgen Forest was a 50-square-mile mass of dense German pine forest along the Belgian-German border. Eisenhower's broad front demanded it be cleared. It protected the right flank of any Allied advance into Germany. What nobody fully understood was that the Germans were not defending the forest for the forest. They were defending it for the Rohr River dams, specifically the Schwamenau Dam. If the Allies reached the Rohr without controlling those dams, the Germans could release 100 million cubic meters of water. The Rohr Valley would flood. Any Allied crossing would be trapped. American commanders did not make the Rohr dams their primary objective until November 1944, 2 months into the campaign. By then, 4 American infantry divisions had been effectively destroyed and rebuilt inside the forest. German commander General Erich Brandenberger later wrote that his forces had been surprised by the American decision to fight through the forest floor to floor rather than bypass it. He called it a battle the Americans had no need to fight the way they fought it. The Germans held the dams until February 1945. They blew the floodgates on February 10th. The Ruhr flooded. The Allied crossing was delayed 2 weeks. The Battle of the Bulge, December 16, 1944. At 5:30 a.m. on December 16, 1944, 250,000 German soldiers and 1,000 tanks attacked through the Ardennes forest across a 75-mile front. This was Operation Wacht am Rhein, Hitler's last major offensive in the West. It struck the weakest point in the Allied line, precisely because Eisenhower's broad front strategy had stretched American forces thin across every sector. The 106th Infantry Division, green, recently arrived in Europe, had 9,000 men in the Ardennes. It was overrun in 48 hours. 2 of its 3 regiments, approximately 7,000 men, surrendered. The largest mass surrender of American forces since the Civil War. The German plan required capturing Allied fuel depots. The entire offensive depended on it. If German armored columns couldn't capture American fuel, their tanks would run dry within 72 hours. They did not capture the fuel. Sergeant Charles Hensel and a small team at Stavelot destroyed a fuel dump containing 2.5 million gallons of gasoline, burning it rather than allowing capture, in a decision made without orders on his own judgment. That decision may have stopped the German offensive cold. The Battle of the Bulge cost the United States Army 75,000 casualties in 5 weeks. German losses, approximately 67,000 to 100,000. And at the height of the crisis, with American forces reeling and the German breakthrough threatening to split the Allied line, Eisenhower made a decision that nearly ended his relationship with every British officer in the theater. He temporarily gave Montgomery command of American forces north of the Bulge, including the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies. Montgomery stabilized the northern shoulder. Then he held a press conference. On January 7, 1945, Montgomery stood before the world's press and described the Battle of the Bulge as if the British had saved the Americans. He spoke of tidying up the battlefield and described how he had taken certain steps to respond to the crisis. He did not mention that the Americans had stopped the German advance before he took command. He did not mention Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division under Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe held against 2 German divisions and replied to a German surrender demand with a single word: nuts. He did not mention that American soldiers had died in front of that German wave for 2 weeks before British involvement. The American press exploded. Bradley threatened to resign if Montgomery remained in command of his armies. Patton threatened worse. Eisenhower sent a cable to the combined chiefs of staff on January 30, 1945, stating that the theater was no longer large enough for both himself and Montgomery. One of them would have to go. Churchill intervened personally. Montgomery was made to write a formal letter of apology to Eisenhower, a letter that Montgomery's biographers describe as the most painful document he ever wrote. The Rhine Crossing, March 23rd through 25th, 1945. The final act of the strategic argument played out on the banks of the Rhine. Patton crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim on March 22, 1945, without orders, without preparation, without artillery support, and without telling Eisenhower until it was done. He then telephoned Bradley and said, "Brad, don't tell anyone, but I'm across." He wanted to beat Montgomery. Montgomery crossed the Rhine at Wesel on March 23, 1945, with the most meticulously planned river crossing of the war. 25,000 artillery rounds fired in a preparatory barrage. 2 airborne divisions dropped on the far bank. 16,000 paratroopers. British and American infantry crossed simultaneously under complete artillery cover. German resistance collapsed within 48 hours. It worked. It was everything Montgomery had always advocated: overwhelming force, total preparation, methodical execution. It cost far fewer casualties than Patton's improvised crossing. And it came 24 hours too late to matter symbolically, because Patton was already on the far bank. That timing was not an accident. Patton had moved deliberately. The argument between the two philosophies of war, concentration versus breadth, method versus improvisation, had been settled not by logic or evidence, but by personality, pride, and national politics. The strategic disagreement between Montgomery and Eisenhower was not merely a command inconvenience. It had a body count. Allied casualties in Northwest Europe from D-Day to VE Day: approximately 191,000 killed and 550,000 wounded across all Allied nations. How many of those casualties were directly attributable to strategic mismanagement is impossible to calculate precisely. But military historians have identified specific operational failures that flowed directly from the command dysfunction. The failure to clear the Scheldt estuary, a failure on Montgomery's part, delayed the opening of Antwerp by 83 days and kept the entire Allied force in a state of supply starvation throughout the autumn of 1944. Field Marshal Alan Brooke, chief of the Imperial General Staff and Montgomery's strongest institutional supporter, wrote in his diary on October 5, 1944, "Monty's failure to capture Antwerp in September has been one of the most serious blunders of this war." The failure to concentrate resources at any single point, Eisenhower's systemic flaw, meant that the Allies repeatedly applied insufficient force everywhere, rather than decisive force anywhere. The Hurtgen Forest campaign alone consumed resources that could have cleared the Scheldt or strengthened the Ardennes line. And there was a human dimension that sits beneath all the strategic analysis. Private soldiers, American, British, Canadian, Polish, paid for these command decisions with their bodies. A young Canadian rifleman in the Scheldt estuary died in a flooded Dutch polder because two generals in a caravan in Eindhoven could not reach a workable agreement. An American infantryman froze to death in the Hurtgen Forest because his army was advancing everywhere and had no priority. A British paratrooper surrendered at Arnhem after 4 days of fighting without food, water, or ammunition, because the intelligence warning about SS Panzer divisions had been set aside by planners who wanted to believe their plan would work. These are not abstractions. They are consequences. Germany was defeated by the end of 1944 in every meaningful material sense. Its fuel production had been devastated by Allied strategic bombing. It was fighting simultaneously on the Eastern Front against 6 million Soviet soldiers. Its officer corps was depleted. Its tank production, while still significant, could not replace losses at the rate they were being inflicted. Germany could still fight. It could not win. The question the Allied command faced was not whether they would win. The question was how many men would die before it ended. Every week, the war continued after September 1944 cost approximately 5,000 to 7,000 Allied casualties. Montgomery's argument that a single concentrated thrust could end the war by December 1944 was not provably correct. It rested on assumptions about German collapse that Market Garden itself disproved. Eisenhower's argument that a broad front would eventually exhaust German resistance was correct. It was also expensive, slow, and paid for in blood that might have been saved. The fundamental institutional flaw was this: the Allied command structure was built for political coherence, not operational efficiency. Eisenhower's primary job was to keep the alliance together. That meant no single national force could be given absolute priority. That meant no American general could be seen to serve under a British general. That meant No British general could claim credit for American victories. The structure that made the alliance possible also made the most decisive strategy impossible. The Germans never solved the political problem of fighting on two fronts. The Allies never solved the political problem of fighting as two nations, with different military traditions, different national interests, and different definitions of what victory was supposed to look like. They could win against Germany. They could not fully defeat their own command dysfunction. What made them ultimately unstoppable was not strategic elegance. It was scale. American production, Soviet sacrifice. The sheer crushing weight of materiel that no single strategic disagreement could neutralize. The war ended on May 8, 1945, not in December 1944. The difference was approximately 200,000 Allied casualties and an unknown number of German and civilian deaths. That is the true cost of the argument in Montgomery's caravan. The generals argued, the soldiers fought. Private John Reynolds of Birmingham, England, crossed the Rhine with the British 51st Highland Division in March 1945. He had been in the army since 1942. He survived the war by 11 days. He was killed by a landmine near Bremen on April 19, 1945. He was 23 years old. Private First Class Alvin Carney of Youngstown, Ohio, fought through the Hurtgen Forest with the 4th Infantry Division. He had never been outside Ohio before the war. He suffered severe frostbite in December 1944 and lost 2 fingers. He came home in 1945, went back to work in a steel mill, and never spoke publicly about what he had seen. Corporal Jan Nowak of Krakow, Poland, dropped at Arnhem with the 1st Polish Independent Parachute Brigade on September 21, 1944. The bridge he was meant to reinforce had already fallen. He crossed the Rhine under fire in a rubber dinghy. He was captured the following day. He was liberated from a German prison camp in April 1945, to find that the country he had been fighting to liberate had been given to the Soviet Union at Yalta. He never went home. Sergeant Madeleine Collette of Montreal, Canada, served with the Royal Canadian Army Medical Corps through the campaign to clear the Scheldt estuary. She treated men pulled from flooded Dutch fields with wounds that she later described as beyond anything I had been trained for. She was mentioned in dispatches in November 1944. She died in Montreal in 1998. There are very few veterans of the Northwest Europe campaign still living today. The youngest would be in their late 90s. Most are gone. What they did, what they endured, inside a command structure that was fractured, underfunded logistically, and led by men whose egos sometimes exceeded their judgment, was something that deserves more than strategic analysis. They operated in conditions their commanders argued about in caravans and headquarters. They did not have the luxury of disagreement. They deserve to be remembered not as instruments of strategy, but as people who showed up when asked, in a foreign country, in mud and cold and darkness, and did what they were told, even when what they were told was wrong. If this story matters to you, subscribe to this channel. New videos every day documenting the wars that shaped our world.